It's wonderful to be with everyone this morning as we continue in our study of the book of Daniel. We'll be finishing chapter 11 this morning. And if you turn over to about Daniel chapter 11 and about verse 30, we'll pick up our study in this in just a few minutes. And we just want to reiterate that this is one of the more difficult passages in the Old Testament to understand the history associated with this fifth and final vision that Daniel has about the time leading up to the Messiah. And I just want to reiterate that it's important that we not get too bogged down in all these details. I've told in the class before, I said we should all study Daniel chapter 11 once and understand the history that's associated with that. But I understand many of us are not history buffs, and it may be difficult to remember all the details of this without your notes. But it is important to know that God revealed to Daniel the things that would happen hundreds of years in the future leading up to the time of the Messiah in very great detail. And we have the benefit of looking back on history and helping us understand what was explained to Daniel in this vision. But it's all pointing, all of the visions that Daniel had from starting chapter 2 in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, the great statue, they all have the same focus. They're focused on the events that would lead to the Messiah and his eternal kingdom. And so before we start our class, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll dive in. Lord, we're thankful for your servant Daniel and the prophecies that were revealed to him, prophecies that we can look back on and know that you are sovereign and that your eternal plans will be fulfilled. Father, you have done great things and continue to do great things in our lives. All glory and honor and praise belong to you. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your Son Jesus, for his eternal kingdom, his dominion that will never fade. We are thankful for his resurrection and the hope of our resurrection. We are thankful for the truth of your word that guides us in our daily lives as we try to emulate Christ. We ask for your blessings on this class and all of our Bible studies this morning. And may our group and the individual studies as we engage in studying your Bible strengthen our faith and help us to better praise you and help us to be more like your Son every day. It's in his holy name we pray. Amen. Just real quickly, we've looked at this slide several times, but Daniel chapter 11 covers the history from the Persians. He has this dream under King Cyrus. And it covers the time of King Cyrus through the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, all the way down through the battles that ensue between the generals that take power after Alexander dies. And we finished up on our last time together in the time of Antiochus at about 168 BC. Daniel received this dream in 534 BC. So just think about the time that goes by and all the great things that happen. So we've looked at all these great kings from Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus the Great and Alexander the Great, these great kings and kingdoms. And yet, what were all these dreams pointing to from the very first dream? They're pointing to the Messiah, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, whose king will never fade. And so that's the thing we want to keep in mind whenever we open the book of Daniel. It's so much more than the fiery furnace in the lion's den. So as we left off last time, we recall that Antiochus had gone back into Egypt for the second time to try and conquer Egypt, but Rome had been alerted, and Rome did not want Antiochus to take Egypt because Egypt was the source of their grain. They did not want him to gain that power. And the Roman consul was sent. He met Antiochus on the beach on the east side of Alexandria, and he literally drew a circle around him in the sand and told him that if he stepped outside that circle without agreeing to leave Egypt, that he would be at war with Rome. And that was in verse 30. And let me read verses. I'm going to start in verse 29. I want to read the text real quickly, and then we'll just break it down verse by verse and look at the great history that's associated with this. Starting in verse 29. At that time he shall return and come into the south, speaking about Antiochus. But it shall not be this time as it was before. For the ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and he shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress, and he shall take away the regular burnt offering. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action, and the wise men among the people shall make many understand, though for some days, and they shall stumble by the sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Verse 36. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, but he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of the fortress instead of these. A God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers of many, and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush up against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. And he shall come into the countries and overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But the news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great flurry to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his tent between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. I just want to point out one thing, too, as we look at this. We've mentioned this a couple times. The events we read about in chapter 11 can skip ahead in time 10, 20, 50, 100 years without any indication of text. And so we just want to remember that as you read Daniel chapter 11, that it's not necessarily, it is a continuous chronological flow, but it skips ahead without notice, and only those who study the history understand where it's jumped ahead. So let's pick up in the second part of verse 30, and we'll discuss that. And he shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant, and shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. This is speaking again about Antiochus. This is a continuation of the thought about Antiochus the fourth. And of course, we know he was humiliated by the Romans when they stopped him from taking Egypt. But historians say that there were rumors that Antiochus had been killed in Egypt. The Israelites were tired of Antiochus. He had already been terrible to them. They wanted the Egyptians to gain control. And so it may be that Antiochus, part of this thing when he goes back to Israel and is so harsh on them, is he may have gotten word that the Jews were trying to rise up against him. They thought he had been assassinated or killed in Egypt, and he's infuriated by the Romans. He's infuriated by the insolence of the Jews in Israel and in Jerusalem, and he goes back to Jerusalem, and it was terrible what the events that happened when he got back to Jerusalem. Verse 31. Remember, we're at about 168 BC. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. So when he got back to Jerusalem, he desecrated the temple. He offered pigs on the brazen altar. He made it illegal to have a copy of the scriptures. He killed and harassed anybody that was refused to follow the Hellenistic culture that he was proposing. And of course, we'll talk about it a little more, but all these events are leading up to the Maccabean revolt. And he had already started this Hellenization process before this final venting, but we're in about November, December of 168 BC and these events happen. He even ordered that the Jewish name for the Hebrew God, our God, would be changed to Zeus Olympus. He also tore down many of the walls in Jerusalem. And you have a handout, in your handout you have a photo of this. He built a fortress, a garrison, out of the rubble from tearing down the walls to create a garrison with his soldiers to protect Jerusalem in case the Romans or the Egyptians came after him after his humiliation in Rome. And that wasn't discovered, I think it was it's in your handout, I think it was 2016. They were doing some excavation in a parking lot, and they found the ruins of this garrison in Acre that he built out of the rubble. He went around Jerusalem erecting pagan altars, and he plundered the temple and the treasury and took out the golden candlesticks and the altar and just plundered that. And it goes on and on what he did. Of course, he was known to the Jews as the madman, and he certainly was that. And it was bad news for Jerusalem. And the text here just fits perfectly with what went on with Antiochus. He didn't remain in Jerusalem but a few weeks. He left his generals there, and then he went up to fight the Parthians. And Parthia is kind of northeast of Syria, kind of north of modern-day Iraq. And he left some of his rulers there, and they were the enforcers of what he had set in motion here. And thousands were murdered, plundering the city. And like I said, possession of scriptures was a death penalty. Circumcision, the rite of circumcision was a death penalty. Public prayer, it was just, he just literally tried to turn off Judaism in Jerusalem. Men were butchered and women were sold in slavery. It was a terrible thing. And so even though Antiochus IV left Jerusalem, the horror, the terror continued for some time. But this is all, that's a whole study in itself. We'll mention a few things, but this is what led to the Maccabean revolt. And this is just an amazing thing here. In verse 32, the first part of verse 32, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. There were Jews in Jerusalem at this time that were all in favor of the Hellenistic. They wanted to be modern. They wanted to be like the rest of the world. And these were the forerunners of the Sadducees that we read about in the New Testament. They wanted to be like the rest of the world. They wanted to embrace this Hellenistic culture, and they were all for doing away with the Jewish. We talked about Jason, who bought the high priest. He changed his name from Joshua to Jason. He wanted to be like the Greeks. And in 175, we talked about this a little bit. Jason bought the high priesthood from Antiochus, and a few years later, Menelaus, who was not of the proper lineage, he paid 300 talents more than Jason had, and he got the high priesthood. And of course, we said that from that time on, the high priest was a defiled office. It was never what it should be. And when you get into the Maccabean revolt, there were two groups: the Tobiads, who were the Hellenizers, they were the liberals, and the Oniads, who was from the high priest Onias, the high priest, they were the conservative groups. And so there's this conflict going on inside Israel and Jerusalem between the people that want to remain faithful to God and the people that want to be like the Greeks, the rest of the world. So that's what this verse, and you have this in your handout, but there's a quote in 1 Maccabees it even speaks to this about how they wanted to be like the Gentiles around them. And I think you also should have this in your handout. It's a reference to Jason when he bought the high priesthood, that he at once shifted his countrymen over to the Greek way of life, and he destroyed the lawful ways of living and introduced new customs contrary to the law. So, of course, Antiochus and his generals that followed, they sought out the alliance with these people that wanted to be Greeks. And so this first part of verse 32 speaks to that. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. As you move to verse 30, the second part of verse 32, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise men among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by the sword, by the captivity and plunder. This is speaking to this revolt that happens after all this action by Antiochus and his remaining generals to Hellenize Jerusalem. And you're seeing now the other side of the equation, the people that stand up and try and oppose this Hellenization of Jerusalem. In your handout, and we see this terror that spreads. And initially, it was all in Jerusalem. And then about a year later, in 167 BC, it starts to spread outside of Jerusalem into the villages outside. In 167, in the village of Modin, which is about 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem, one of the Antiochus' soldiers goes in and demands that the priest there, Matthias Hasmonean, offer a pig as a sacrifice, a pagan sacrifice. He refused to do that, and another Jew in the village offered to do it because he was threatened with death if he didn't offer this pagan sacrifice. Another Jew stepped forward to offer it to save him. Matthias stepped up and killed both the Jew that offered to do that and the Syrian soldier, the Roman soldier that had demanded this sacrifice. That was the beginning in 167. That's the beginning of the Maccabean revolt. And so this is what this is. They shall stand firm and take action. That's what happened. They stood up to all this. And the wise men among the people shall make many understand. You have this conservative group that's trying to follow God and his ordinances. They stand up and make many understand. But if you study that, it goes on for a number of years, and then they get more and more secular, and they fall into the same trap that power often does. So we see that, just real quickly, kind of how this unfolds is Antiochus was made aware of this revolt, and he thought he could put this down easily because you've got pretty weak forces there. He's got a great army, but Judas, Matthias' son, took 6,000 men against 50,000 Syrian soldiers, and he had a victory over them because they're fighting a guerrilla warfare. They're not standing out on the battleground just coming at one another. They're fighting a guerrilla war. And then Antiochus sent his best general, Lysias, with 60,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and Judas had a force of only 10,000. And it was the small town of Emmaus. You remember Christ on the road to Emmaus. And he has a victory there. Well, that led Judas to go and attack Jerusalem. He's emboldened by these victories, and you just have to think that God's hand was in all of this. And of course, God has foretold all of this hundreds of years in the future, and he attacks Jerusalem. And it was kind of a long siege. The attack wasn't successful just overnight, But while the attack was ongoing, the men entered the temple and began to cleanse the temple of its the pagan deformations that had happened in the temple. So while the battle is still raging, they rush in and try to cleanse the temple. And in verse 30, that's still speaking to this, and we'll read verse 34 in a minute. But this is the origins. I think growing up I heard Hanukkah and really didn't relate to what all that is. Well, that is the efforts to cleanse the temple and light the menorah, and they didn't have enough oil for the menorah, and they didn't think it would last. Well, it lasted. Well, this is in December of 165, and they remove the abomination that makes desolate when they go in and cleanse the temple, and the daily sacrifices were restored, and this could possibly be a reference also from Daniel chapter 8, where we read the 2,300 evenings and mornings, that this could be this event that that's speaking to. But in the New Testament, in John chapter 10, we read about the Feast of Lights, or the Feast of Dedication. That's the feast that was celebrated to recognize or to honor the efforts here in 165 BC to consecrate the temple after this desecration by Antiochus and his forces. So that's kind of an amazing thing. I think we don't think about that much. So when we hear about the Jews celebrating Hanukkah, well, Jesus celebrated Hanukkah that we read in John chapter 10.
Just quick, I know you referenced Maccabees a couple of times, but can you just explain?
Yeah, I think many of us have heard about Maccabees. First and Second Maccabees are in the Catholic Bible, and Maccabees is really not a canonical book, and it shouldn't be in our Old Testament, but it is one of the best histories of this time. If we read Josephus or some of the other Greek historians, it's a great history that helps us understand these events that we're maybe not that familiar with. So Maccabees does have a benefit in that the history of this period of time is recorded for us. And I think there's 8 books of Maccabees altogether. But so it's not a book that we should shy away from. We just need to understand that it's really just a recorded history that can enlighten us in some of the details that we might not be familiar with and that sort of thing. So let's continue on with verse 34. This is still speaking to the Jewish persecution in the Maccabean revolt. When they stumble, and I think the ASV says fall, when they fall, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. So when they stumble or they fall, this is a reference to the Jewish people that are under the Syrian persecution, and they shall receive a little help. This is a reference to the Maccabean guerrilla fighters who were fighting against the Syrians. And many shall join themselves in them with flatteries. So we talked about how that there were this group in Jerusalem especially that wanted to be like the Greeks and the Gentiles. Those people were still there, but they kind of hypocritically joined with the Maccabees because the tide sort of changed now, and it seems like the forces are stronger against the Maccabees. They seem to be gaining strength, so many of those people with flattery, they joined even though they still wanted to be like the Gentiles. Some of the wise shall stumble. If you study, I mentioned it earlier, but when you study this period, they became the Hasmonean dynasty, this results of the Maccabean revolt. They increasingly became secular and started to even then persecute the conservative Jews. They were filled with all the power they had gained, and they were just more interested in their own power and that sort of thing. And there were people there that hypocritically joined, and then the Hasmonean dynasty, they started to go down. And so that's just it's a really interesting period just to study that period, because it sort of sets the table for the time of Christ, and you see the culture that's existing in Israel and Jerusalem when Christ comes. So now we move to verse, yeah.
Is that when the Sanhedrin started?
Pardon?
Did the Sanhedrin start during this time too?
This is going to take you up to about the time of Herod in 37 BC, and really the Hasmonean dynasty, all that in, I think around 60 BC. So it's Pompey came in with the Roman forces and put all that down in 63 BC. So we're still a little bit before Christ at that point. So if we get to verses 36 through 45, until you get up to this point of Daniel chapter 11, there's really no controversy in the text about the events that we read about. We've talked about the futurists, the people that believe in premillennialism or the dispensations. We talked about at the beginning how they try to take things in Daniel and twist that around. It's kind of like we have a theology we got to try and find a verse for, or a section of the Bible to fit our thinking. Well, till you get up to verse 36, there's really no controversy about the events we've been reading about. It's pretty straight for everybody. Pretty much agrees with what we've talked about. But then when you get to verses 36 through 45, this is where the futurists try and insert the Antichrist. They try to insert things that appeal to their thinking. And we talked about that in one of our classes, is this idea of the premillennialist and the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That teaching really didn't start until the mid-1800s in any kind of earnest form. So this is where, and if you have a Bible that has a commentary in it, you may get to these verses and you'll see Antichrist start to be inserted. So we want to go through this because I think there's a very logical explanation for the things we read here. And this is where they try to insert their doctrine. But let me ask you a question. As we looked at all these visions, from the metal statue to the terrifying beast, and now that there's just a progression. There's a progression through history that we read about. And so when we started in Daniel chapter 11, we started at the time of Cyrus the Great and Darius the Mede, and the text walks us through the Alexander the Great and his generals. We spent a lot of time about the 6 Syrian wars and that sort of thing. But there's no insinuation at all that there's any kind of gap in this history that we're reading about. So we shouldn't throw our idea in that somehow or another I get to verse 36 and there's some huge gap in time until the next events. So when we think about the next events that are happening, as we say, we get to the Maccabean revolt, then Pompey comes in, and then who is the next great leader over Israel and Jerusalem? Because the fourth beast the terrifying beast was Rome, right? Well, who is the next leader that comes in and is ruling over Israel and Jerusalem at the time of Christ? Who's the king? Herod. If we just follow the progression, and we might say Rome/Herod, but Rome/Herod is in charge. So if we're just looking at the chronology of things that happen as we go through Daniel chapter 11, that's the next kingdom that happens until the Messiah comes. And so that is one of the main points I wanted us to get out of this study is, one, that not that we just can remember every detail without our notes, but we shouldn't be afraid of this. And when we talk to our friends and neighbors that have this futurist view, that we can sit down and say, there's a logical chronology of events that's explained here, and it's all leading up to the Christ. And Christ fulfilled his role, his mission, his charge from God the Father in the first century. There's no insinuation whatsoever in any of these texts that there's some sort of gap in the timeline in these prophecies that Daniel has. So we're going to look at Daniel chapter verse 36, but just real quickly, so chapter 11, verses 21 through 32, we've been reading about Antiochus Epiphanes from about 175 BC when his father died down to 164 BC. And then in verses 32 through 35, we've been reading about the Maccabean revolt, as we said, leading up to the time of Rome's dominion over Israel and Jerusalem, with Herod being the king, the local king that's ruling from them. So that's the chronology of things that we're reading about. So let's look at verse 36. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. So the great question of verse 36 is, who is this king? And if you study this, there are Bible scholars who have a variety of answers to that question. E.J. Young's commentary lists 9 different options for who this is. And just, if you can see this on the screen, it's in your handout, but some say it's Antiochus IV. Well, he died in 168 BC. So it couldn't be we've moved past that time in the chronology of things described in Daniel chapter 11. Oddly enough, some say it's Constantine the Great. He lived in 306 to 337 AD. Quote, he was the first, quote, Christian Roman emperor. Some say it just refers to the Roman Empire. It's not an individual at all. Some say it's to Pompey. Well, he would have been kind of he put an end to the Maccabean revolt, but that doesn't seem to fit with the chronology of leading up to the time of the Messiah. Some want to throw out it's the Pope, the papal system. Then in your commentaries, you may read it's the Antichrist. It's some far future date. But as we said, the character that makes the most sense as you think about the chronology is the Roman Empire / in the person of Herod the Great. He is the next ruler over them. So, when he talks about this king in verse 36, there's no reference to the geography of this king at all. We read about the king of the north, the king of the south. Well, that sets the location of where these kings were, but there's none of that. We said Antiochus the fourth's already passed away. So the futurists want to paint this out somewhere in the future. But Herod the Great ruled from 37 BC to 4 BC at the time of Christ. And of course, his ancestors, his lineage in Herod the Great live all the way up and rule all the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem. So, we could say it's Herod the Great. We could say it's the Herods. We could say it's the Roman Empire. But that seems to be the one that makes the most sense to me. And Herod the Great was a ruler at the time of Christ's birth. He did whatever he willed. The Romans left him alone as long as he collected the taxes and he kept the peace. When we read the accounts in the New Testament, it seems that even all the way up to the death of Christ, they were so worried that there would be a revolt in Jerusalem, and they didn't want the Romans to come in and exercise any authority. But he continued that idea of secularizing Jerusalem with the Hellenistic approach, because Rome was an extension of the Hellenization. They carried many of the Greek practices forward. Herod the Great built. We know about the construction of the temple, which was just amazing. It wasn't even finished. Really, it was past the time of Christ all the way up to almost the destruction of Jerusalem. They're still working on the temple. It was such an amazing thing. But he built pagan temples, and he practiced Caesar worship. But, he referred to himself as the king of the Jews, but he wasn't Jewish. He courted the favor of the rich Jews, the Sadducees, and he built Caesarea on the sea, which was one of the most amazing cities in the ancient world. If you ever have time to just go online and study that, it's just an amazing thing. In 40 BC, the Senate named Herod king of the Jews. There's kind of two problems with that. The Jews already had a king from the Hasmonean family, and number two was he really wasn't a Jew. His father was Idumean from Edom, and he was forced to convert to Judaism during the Hasmonean rule. And his mother was a Nabatean princess. So in reality, he was not a Jew. He was, I guess you could say, he was a proselyte Jew, in that during the Hasmoneans, they would come into areas and just, much like we think of Islam today, they would force people to convert to Judaism. And but Rome was looking for a very strong ruler in Israel and Jerusalem. And there's a lot of politics, but I won't have time to go into that he went through. And he finally conquered Jerusalem in 37 BC, but there wasn't a welcoming committee because the Jews did not like him. And it's just a sad thing, but he was the king of Israel and Jerusalem at the time of Christ, and it really seems to fit the chronology of events that we read about here in Daniel chapter 11. In your handout, I'm not going to take time to read it because we just got 5 or 6 minutes left, but there's quotes from Josephus about Herod, and they're very telling about the events that went on, and it's just a kind of an amazing story of how he came to power, and it's something we just don't have time to go into great depth, but he was an amazing man, a very strong ruler. I will mention this. Herod the Great is known for the slaughter of the infants in Matthew's gospel, but he was an amazing builder, as we said, and he was just very, very powerful ruler over Jerusalem when Christ came to rule. Verse 37, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Josephus records that he referred to himself, he'd use this expression, our fathers. Even though he wasn't a Jew, he would, he's trying to claim to be a Jew, but he's not really a Jew. He would use that term, our fathers. He really didn't like Jews or Judaism, and he was very arrogant towards them. We see all that. And I think the term, or to the one beloved by women, that could very possibly be a reference to Christ in reference to Herod. And so he was an evil man, but he was the next one in the chronology of the events that, if we're trying to follow the chronology of events that Daniel chapter 11 portrays, Herod seems to be the next in the form of, in the person of Rome. He seems to be the next person in line. Verse 38, he shall honor the God of the fortress instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. We talked about Caesarea, and you have a photo of that, an artist rendering of that in your handout. And he made, Caesarea was named after Caesar. So he tried to honor Rome in every possible way he could by the things he built because he wanted to stay in power. And so we just see that over and over in the things he constructed and how he conducted himself. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack, contend with him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. This is speaking to the events of when Julius Caesar was murdered. Mark Antony and Octavian and another general, they kind of formed an alliance to rule over Rome. And this is speaking to the fact that Mark Antony and Cleopatra, we talked about Cleopatra, we're down to Cleopatra the 7th by this time, because we've moved forward in time 100 years from the time, or more than 100 years from the time that Antiochus the Great gave his daughter Cleopatra to the Ptolemy. I can't remember what number the Ptolemy was, but gave him his daughter to try and form an alliance with Egypt. Well, we moved forward to Cleopatra the 7th, and this is where this battle comes between Mark Antony and Octavian, who would become Augustus Caesar, the first true Caesar or first true emperor of Rome. And in 31 BC, there was a great battle, and that was the start of the end for Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Just real quick, Augustus was the first, this is in your handout, Augustus was the first, quote, emperor of Rome, even though Julius is usually counted as the first when you look at the timeline of all of them. And we go all the way down to Nero, and that's happening in, that should be Nero from 54 to 68 AD, in the time of Paul's missionary journeys. And then in 68 to 69, we have this wars and rumors of wars. It's discussed in the Olivet Discourse, and then Vespasian and Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70. So let's get to the very end here, and verse 41. I'll skip ahead here. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom and Moab and the main parts of the Ammonites, he shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become rulers of treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. So after the battle of Actium against Augustus and lost my train of thought. Augustus and Mark Antony. Mark Antony flees to Alexandria with Cleopatra, and then Augustus, or Octavian, who became Augustus, he marches down to, this is going to be the final battle. This is the end of it. And it's interesting that after the battle, Augustus took control of Egypt and Libya and Ethiopia. That's what the text speaks to. But he did not take Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. And you see in this map that the area there on the left of Israel, you have Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. He did not get that. That did not come till much, much later that those areas fell under the control of Rome. So when the text here is from verse 41 down to verse 33 describing these areas, it's the conquest of Octavian, Augustus, Caesar, to conquer this area. Mark Antony committed suicide in Alexandria when Mark Antony approached the area. So real quickly, we got a couple minutes, verse 44. But the news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. So the question here is, are you still talking about Augustus in this battle with Mark Antony, or is the timeline changed? I believe the timeline is changed here, and this is a reference to Herod. From the east and the north, what was Herod? Who came from the east and had an announcement that terrified Herod the Great? Yeah. Wise men came from the east. And from the north, he was always worried about the Romans coming down and taking his power away from him. And of course, he did many to destruction. He killed all the infants in Bethlehem, and he was just a paranoid man. And so he was always worried about, the wise men from the east came, that troubled him, and he was always worried that forces from the north would come and put him down. Verse 45, this is one of the reasons why I think it sort of cements my belief that these last two verses are speaking about Herod the Great. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, and he shall come to his end with none to help him. Well, where did Herod the Great have his two greatest palaces? One was in Caesarea, and that was where Paul was held for 2 years before he was shipped off to stand before the emperor. And then he also had a great palace in Jerusalem that was on the east side of the city. So he had two great temples in Israel, one in Caesarea and one. So he had one on the sea and one in the glorious holy mountain, reference to Jerusalem. And then it said, he shall come to his end with none to help him. Herod died a very painful and lonely death, and Josephus gives you graphic details about how he died. So after a great deal of study, that's the reason, one of the reasons I reached the conclusion that these last two verses have shifted from Augustus and his battles with Mark Antony in Egypt and Moab and Edomites and all that to Herod the Great. And of course, Herod the Great was the king in charge when the Messiah came. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to me. I want to, before we close our class, I just want to thank, Jay will finish us out in chapter 12 on Wednesday night. And I just want to thank Jay and Dan for their efforts in presenting all this material. It's some very difficult material, and they've done a great job as we've worked as a team to present all this. And it's just been my prayer that we'd have a greater appreciation for Daniel and prophecies, and not just be limited in our understanding and depth of knowledge to just the lion's den and the fiery furnace, and that we could be able to talk to our friends and neighbors, maybe with the help of some of the notes we've passed out, but you could make an explanation of these prophecies and what it's looking forward to. And I think that should be our big takeaway of Daniel, is he was a faithful man, a faithful servant of God. He was beloved by God, but God was revealing to him the things that would happen leading up to the Messiah. And that should be our takeaway, is God made great promises hundreds of years in the future, and they were all fulfilled, and were all fulfilled in Christ, in his eternal kingdom, his eternal domain that will never go away. So appreciate all your attention. I know this is the last three lessons kind of be a lecture. Maybe Jay can have a little more conversation, but I appreciate your attention.